Hello and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist. And today I'm excited to have another licensed marriage and family therapist on. Today I am joined by Angela Skurtu. Shoot, I didn't even check my name pronunciation. I'm a terrible podcast
Right.
host. We
Thank
just
you
talked
so
about
much.
this off camera.
No, Skurtu's perfectly. I've nobody ever does it perfect on the first try. So like kudos to you.
All right. Maybe, 2 or 3 years ago, I saw you present at AMFT conference. So maybe like it stuck in there long enough where I could get it right. So Angela, thanks for joining me. I'm excited to talk with you. I follow you on YouTube. So Angela, I always like to start with the same question, which is how'd you get into the mental health field? What was your introduction into doing this work?
Yeah. So my introduction. So I got into this field. That's a long story. As you asked the question, I'm like, oh man. So I came from it's interesting. I just read. So here's a little backstory. I probably have ADHD too, by the way. So you'll hear it in the way I talk. But like,
Yeah.
so I just looked up this morning the fawn response, like, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And I have a very high fawn response. And I was looking at, I was like, I want to research, like, where does this come from? And it said common in abusive religious communities. And I was like, oh, so that's my intro to like how I got started. I got started in an abusive religious community, and I'm not going to mention them because, they'll out themselves over time, to be honest. All of these communities do. But basically, yeah, it was an abusive religious community. And as a result, I have a very strong fawn response. But anyhow, like where the abuse came from is shaming sexuality, basically shaming females and shaming anybody other than. So if you didn't fit into a cisgender heteronormative, they wouldn't have even used those words. Those like saying those words would probably be like red flags for them, or like the patriarchy, like, that's how you know you're in an abusive religious community, by the way, if they're like frightened by these terms or overwhelmed or whatever. But so anyhow, all that's to say, I was raised in a very shame-based community around sex. And as a result, basically, I have very high compassion, very, very high compassion. I always have. And I just, over time, as I was growing up and working with different people, like gay people in my religious community, and even women, like it was those two populations. All my friends would be basically getting married too young because they were waiting till marriage, doing the purity culture thing, virgins until marriage.
Right.
Then a year later, I was still the person people would come to talk about things. They'd say, yeah, sex just isn't for me. I'm not having a good time anymore. I'm struggling with this. I'm doing it for him, which is a fawn response. Just interest, it's like, it was just hitting me this morning. But so anyhow, that like I had to do my own personal work to like become a sex positive therapist and to basically change all of that, like shift that old world lifestyle. And some of it happened during my education, college and grad school. So I went and became a licensed marriage and family therapist. And then I became an ASEX certified sex therapist. But the evolution from there to here has been, of course, all of these years, right? 20 years of time and a lot of unraveling of old shame and realizing that that's just not who I am anymore. And I'm not going to hold on to any of that stuff. But even today, there's still little bits of it where you're like, oh, where did that one come from? I thought I got you.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is fascinating. I didn't know this was part of your story because I work with religious trauma. So that's what I joke.
Interesting.
I keep finding guests who work in the religious trauma spaces or my neurodivergent folks. I like to say my neurodivergent brain finds other neurodivergent brains.
Of course.
So was like going off to school and getting your education important for you, or is that kind of like you pieced it together as you were going through it?
I think I pieced it together as I went through it, right? Like, so before I went to grad school, I was already starting to have trouble, like, and have to figure out how to resolve my compassion for LGBTQ folks and my religious belief system, which was like, you're going to hell, like pretty much at Christmas. I recently went to one of these churches a year ago and they were like, it's Christmas, but they're like, just remember, you're going to hell. But Merry Christmas, Happy Jesus, go have presents. It's like, I don't know. It's funny because me and my partner come from the same religious background, and we both went because of family. We're like, whatever, we'll support family. But we were like, he says to me, only in this kind of church will they talk about hell on Christmas.
Yeah.
And like, I
Yeah.
just went to a wedding this weekend too. And like somewhere in there was a little evangelizing, this is your opportunity. God's coming any moment. There's always like rapture talk and the world's going to fall apart. I think that's all they live for, is for the end of the world. Like there's no real like joy in life beyond the end.
Yeah. It's all for the eternal prize, not for living in the moment.
Exactly. But it's a lot of hard, painful work for them. So yeah, to answer your question, it evolved over time for sure. And then I just think, getting I went to Hawaii and Oregon for my bachelor's and master's degree. So very, very liberal states. Actually, it was really cool to be in my religion in Hawaii, because in Hawaii, I realized it was out of place, like how far it was in its like how far strange it was, my religious background. Like I had my first experiences in Hawaii where they're like, they kind of were taken aback by how strange the religion, our version of the religion was. So I realized that also in my family, it was a little more aggressively religious than even other people in the same religious camp.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I grew up parochial school, K through 12. So like I went to University of Minnesota, which is a Big Ten university, 60,000 students. And it was like my first time being around not super religious people. And like, yeah, that awareness of, oh, this is weird, huh? Like I'm weird, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting how it happens in college. That's the most common time that people leave their religious, their historic religious belief systems, is in college, because suddenly they learn new things and they're like, oh, there's something that exists other than this world that I've been raised and almost kind of like brainwashed into my whole life. Huh.
Yep. Yeah. What was your introduction to marriage and family therapy? Why was that kind of the thing that stuck for you?
Yeah, I did start with marriage and family therapy. I started with marriage and family therapy because, well, it started with sex. I was like, I know I want to do sex therapy, but then I realized, like sex happens with at least more than one person some of the time. I know people masturbate and stuff, but like for the most part, I hope you're not at war with yourself when you're masturbating, but there can be that too. I've learned as a sex therapist. But so I started with marriage therapy because I knew you needed to get a license in some field before becoming a sex therapist. And I was like, well, that makes sense. Let's do couples therapy where you're working with more than one person. Because I wanted to make sure that like I was dealing with the whole couple, not just the sex part, which even when you get certified as a sex therapist, you have to do holistic work, right? Like you don't just separate somebody from their sex life and suddenly they're like, oh, I fixed this, but the rest of my life is shit. That's not how it works.
Right. Let's see. So we were talking about wanting to do the sex therapy as kind of being the thing that pulled you towards marriage and family therapy, not being able to pull somebody out of their relationship or their other life context and just fix the sex part and then expect everything to be great.
Yeah, exactly. I've noticed I have to do kind of parallel tracks. That was a long word. Parallel tracks where you're both working on the relationship and the sexuality. And actually that's to usually appease a heterosexual male, to be honest.
Sure.
That doesn't mean that it's not relevant. So like, I think it's relevant to work on both. Like you can work on a sex life and you can work on the marriage at the same time. But often if you focus solely on the relational aspects and the emotional aspects, then the guy gets frustrated and impatient. And because this is my joke, it's a little bit of a stereotype, but not everybody fits this. But the stereotype is as long as we're having sex again, everything's fine. Right?
Yeah.
And so if we're not having sex, we're still having problems. And so if we can get them working on both, then typically the guy will have a little more patience with the other part. But it's not always easy to do because there's usually a female in these heterosexual relationships. And she's always saying, no, we have to work on the emotions to get better at the sex. I can't be sexual without feeling emotionally close to you. And to be fair, neither of them is right or wrong. They're both right. They're both wrong. Right. Like, so I try to explore how can we work on these in tandem. And what's interesting though is like when people are having sex, then they get more of those feel good chemicals, like your oxytocin, your dopamine releases, right? And those feel good chemicals do give us a little more patience and tolerance for working through conflict. And so I always try to bring in a little bit of the scientific reason behind, actually even just learning to cuddle some and it doesn't have to be full penetrative sex, but even just having affectionate type sexual interactions can help with creating those chemicals that give you a space in your emotional relationship to be more tolerant and kind with each other. But I still want to help people with their conflict, because if you have a big blow up, then there's still that, like, I call it going offline, but like couples basically go offline for a while where they just shut down. So fight, flight, freeze. It's a little bit of the freeze. I'm not sure where shut down, if that's more freeze or fun, but they just shut down for a bit or go offline, some version of dissociation basically, until they come back on. And then it's like they're starting the process over again. So we still have to get conflict more respectful, or any work they do in the sexual realm just gets put on the back burner naturally because of the coping that bodies have to go through to get out of that space.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And you use, yeah, that does. You use a lot of trauma language when you're talking about even just conflict. Like these fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses are all what we would talk about as a trauma response.
Yeah, it's interesting. So after 2020, this is going all the way back to the pandemic, I've realized that I have to do more trauma treatment with people going through conflict than I did prior to 2020. Like I used to, before 2020, work with couples on the fair fighting rules, or like some of Gottman's basic skills, like soften approach, offering repairs. These are all just communication skills, but like they're communication skills you can do if you're just slightly irritated or annoyed. But once you go full blown into fight or flight, you really need to have a trauma response treatment, like to help people manage their emotions and support themselves. And something happened in 2020, I think you all know, is the pandemic. We went through a global trauma. And so I remember I was, during that time, I kept having to pull out my trauma skills again and again, because people weren't fighting just annoyed or frustrated anymore. People were full blown in one of their coping skills, like fight, flight, freeze, or acquiesce. And since then, I've basically been retraining couples, everyday couples, on how to manage and support themselves through, this is the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is the nervous system that kicks on when you're in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And basically when you experience threat. And we all experienced a global threat that just lasted. And so that I feel like this is just the outcome of people going through a pretty severe trauma, but not realizing how much it impacted them. And of course, you're a therapist too, Jeremy. So I'm sure you would have to let me know, but I'm sure you're experiencing some of the impact of that, right?
Yeah, I'm kind of processing as you're talking, because I think it's interesting. I went back to school and got my certification in religious trauma coming out of the pandemic, because I realized that's what I wanted to focus on working with. And so I tied so much more of my trauma work as being because I had a new toolkit to use. But as you're kind of talking about like the global trauma and needing to soothe more people's nervous systems, that just kind of makes sense that that's all coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah. And of course, not all of it is, because the religious trauma is a gift that keeps on giving. I mean,
Yeah.
it's been around forever. So yeah, people probably had those trauma responses before. This is just the first time recently where we all went through a pretty severe trauma, and all of us kind of went into that nervous system to support ourselves, right? So it's good you got the skills for sure. We need them.
Yeah. Well, and it's fascinating too, because I think I talk a lot about some of the gaps that therapists have in school, and some of the things that I think we struggle with in education. I thought I was trauma informed until I started specifically working with a trauma population. And then I was like, oh no, like I need to go back and learn more stuff, and I need to like formalize how I'm working with this, because it's knowing about trauma doesn't mean that you know how to work with it. Just knowing that it exists or being able to identify it is different than being able to work with it.
you bring up a good point there too, because I mean, grad school is this 2-year period. They basically give you a sprinkling of a lot of different topics, but really as therapists, we need to go beyond that, right? I'm actually really grateful that I already had a plan after grad school, excuse me, to really focus in on sex therapy, because I do think therapists should focus in on something. Like, you really only get like a basic jack of all trades type of education to get started in grad school, which is good. It's not like bad education, but it's really a precursor to going deep into something that means something to you, so that you become like, you really become an expert in your field. I think that's a necessity to be a good therapist.
Yeah, I agree. Was your master's program for marriage and family? Did you find a program that was specific to that?
Yeah, I went to University of Oregon, and it was very specifically couples and family therapy. It was a COAMP approved group, and I loved their education. I think they really tried to give a class in every potential thing. But even in so I really hail it as an excellent program. And I still think they could have done a little better on teaching parenting. I don't know if many graduate schools teach parenting education, finance, because if you think of couples, like, what are their biggest fights? Parenting, finance, sex. Those are the top three. And I don't remember having any classes that specifically focused. We did have a sex class, but it's just one, because again, it's grad school. You only have so much time. It's 2 years. I had to do more formal training in sex therapy. And I've also had to do more of my own personal training in the parenting and the finances too. And then it's interesting because even beyond that, like career coaching, like as a couples therapist, you end up, you could probably attest to this too, but you end up doing all of the therapies, right? Like you have to do trauma therapy. I have to teach people, even do business coaching sometimes, because it's like, what do I want out of my life? Like quality of life. Am I where I need to be? I end up, in one day you can go from business coaching, finances, to sex and hand jobs, to, oh my God, this is a serious issue. Like whatever, I feel like I'm always like, I don't know. Have you ever seen the balloon guy that's on a car lot that flips up and down like this and that? Like that's the visual I always try to represent when I think of what I do in a day for couples.
Yeah. And for me, I'm neurodivergent. So that for me has always been my drive. I don't want 6 cases about depression back to back to back. The variety really keeps me feeling fresh throughout my day. So having something different. But yeah, it's work to say, yeah, my 2 years master's program and my postgrad did not prepare me for everything. And so figuring out what's within your scope of practice, and then how to help people who are maybe outside your scope of practice but are still in your office. It's that balancing act. So I like learning, which is helpful. That going back and going to conferences and picking up new skills constantly is a motivator too. So, but yeah, it's for all the people I work with who are like, how do you do your job? I don't know. My brain likes all the variety. My brain likes having multiple people in the room. I'm more stimulated by that than just doing one-on-one therapy.
I would agree. So my daughter has ADHD, and that's how I found out that I too have ADHD. I didn't know it before, but I think that's what makes me stimulated as well. Is I thrive on that. If it's one thing too long, I get bored. Boredom is the thing that I'm constantly fighting in my business. And so what's great about owning my own business is I have all these different projects, and it's funny because you mentioned I have a YouTube channel. I have a book I'm writing. I used to have a podcast. I did put that to bed, but there are still some old episodes out there. But I have all these, I get interviewed for podcasts. For me in a day, I could have 5 different things occur, even professionally. And that works better for me. I thrive on that weird, we're doing this, now we're doing this, not too long.
Right.
Because ADHD is all about that executive function, and how do you go beyond just that, I don't know, the first project excitement that you get. Basically, it's the dopamine hit that we get as you're oh, there's a cool new project. I have this idea. So we get our dopamine hit and we're so excited, but the dopamine only lasts for so long. And then it's oh, now how do I keep doing this? Oh my gosh, what do I need to do to put things into my practice to make sure this sustains, or it just falls by the wayside?
Yeah. And it's speaking of something we don't get taught in grad school, owning your own business, right? I don't
Yeah.
know what your experience was, but I had no training in that. It took me a long time to
None.
get the confidence to be like, I can run my own practice. Like, I don't need to work with unethical people or people who aren't practicing in a way that's aligned with how I want to practice. But yeah, the dopamine for sure. Like, I can tell when I have that right balance of it's not them, it's my dopamine. It's me as the therapist being able to balance my caseload so that I can be present for everybody I'm working with.
Yeah, well, and you bring up something important there too, which is like self-care. So every clinician has to figure out their own version of what self-care is. I know personally that if I have 3 couples that fight in a day, then I go basically I call it sociopathic. I can no longer handle emotions or feelings. So I always tell my partner, it's like, this is a time where I can't feel anymore. And he's always like, oh, I love you right now. Because of course our joke, he's a guy, right? So his joke is he doesn't feel anything but like hunger and horny or whatever, but it's a joke. He does have other feelings, but he likes that sort of like, I feel nothing now. I choose to feel nothing.
Sure.
But anyhow, like, yeah, I have to have that sort of self-care of like, I can't deal with emotions anymore.
Yeah. And it's when you're doing couples work, it is a balancing act too, because more stimulating isn't always better because we're human beings too. And if you have too many high intensity cases back to back to back, that can definitely be draining. I've learned about myself since I have 2 kids. Some of the like high risk pregnancy couples that I work with, I can only have a couple of those on my caseload at a time because that becomes very, it's just very hard to work with. It's very draining in a way that before I was a parent, it didn't hit me the same way.
Yeah, that's so interesting how our lives change. Now you have kids, so you probably, you're thoughtful of them and like that experience of just wanting your kid to make it safe and healthy. It's anxiety. Isn't it crazy that like parenting comes with anxiety?
Yeah.
That's the gift of parenting. It's like, they could kill themselves at any moment.
Yeah. I tell couples when they're first getting pregnant often that like the first 2 years of having a child is like the worst for your marriage because you're sleep deprived, you have no resources, and you have this tiny entity that like cannot fend for itself in any way, shape, or form. And it's just like there's not an experience like that. Like you have a pet, you put it in its kennel and you leave for the day. Like that's not what having a kid is like. So
They frown upon you putting babies in kennels, just so you know. You definitely should.
yeah, that's not good for their development.
Well, speaking of that too, so my daughter, she has ADHD. I didn't know this, but like I was thinking back to her first 2 years recently, and like there were some hints, right? Of like, oh, she probably has this, but like this was my first baby. So I had no idea what to expect. My daughter stopped napping like at somewhere around 6 months to a year, like at a very young age. And I remember the daycare lady saying, does she nap for you? And I was like, no, do you get her to nap? Because it'd be great if she napped.
Yeah.
And they were like, no, we just play with her while the other kids sleep. And I'm like, all right. Yeah, that's my experience. But so like, that's partly why I only had one kid is she was a ball of energy. She still is. She is just like, woo, and I am too. I realize like I'm the same ball of energy. Like I can talk all day and I do, but like, and still be like, and I get high speaking, by the way. So like by the end of this podcast, I'm going to be crazy energetic. But so, like, I just didn't realize that like I gave birth to a ball of energy. And as a result, it was exhausting. And like,
Yeah.
I was like, I can't do this with another one. If another one was like, I just couldn't do this. So like, that was it. One and done was good for me. I barely slept.
Yeah. Did you have your you said you didn't know you were ADHD until you had a kid, and then it kind of made you reevaluate some of your experiences?
Yeah. So I started just by talking with my partner. So like I got, so first we did a full workup with her, at UMSL's school psychology program. And we got her diagnosed pretty young, like 5, but you could just see there were things that were a little different, and not even bad different, just different, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm also, as a therapist, I don't see different as wrong. I see it as valuable or positive in some way. Like there will be some strengths, there will be some challenges to all of our personality traits. But I could definitely tell, like, wow, she has so much like energy and she doesn't stop. And it doesn't, like, the whole like when you give somebody like, I'm going to wear this kid out, right? When you try to like get them to run and move. But what's funny is for the ADHD brain, all of that's like boosting her dopamine. So like actually getting her to try to wear herself out just wakes her up. I'm like, what's going on? And she could never get on any sort of sleep cycle that was regular. Like we do our best, and I have a basic, like 9 o'clock is when we put her to bed, but like sometimes she sleeps at 9, sometimes she's in her room drawing. I've got pictures of her with a marker, like falling asleep, because like it would be unreasonable for me to expect her to act any other way, right? But so when I got her diagnosis, then I sat down with my partner, just kind of looking at the symptoms. And I was like, let's do this in like I'm curious what you think of this. Obviously he's not a therapist and I am, but like, it was just to kind of like explore how similar. I just want to have a second party. I'm seeing this in myself. I would like to see what your thoughts are. And he's like, well, I just don't want to like hurt your feelings, or I'm like, no, you're fine. Like I felt like it was a very adult way to do it. But so we kind of just went DSM point by point, looking at some of the symptoms that were there. And I was like, do you see this in me? I don't know if I see this. And he's like, well, Angela, here's where I see it. I'm like, oh, You're right. I totally do that. Like forgetfulness, for example, is one of the symptoms, right? Like forgetting little minor details. But like, I couldn't even count on like only one hand how many times I will forget a small detail, but it'll have this big consequence. And that's one of the, like, I always talk about ADHD as being a very punishing diagnosis because of that like the little detail can have a big consequence. And that's where some of that ADHD shame comes from some of my clients, is this like, how could I have not known this? What's wrong with me? Why did I, like, that's shame. And I consider shame and abuse the same thing. They're pretty much the exact same thing, right? It's the way we treat ourselves or somebody else treated us. But like that, like those minor details can have big consequences for people. So anyhow, I know I'm all over the board answering this question. So basically after going through those symptoms, like it was like, okay, I've got the hyperactive, actually it's a little bit combined, but I do have the hyperactive type, just like my daughter. And I'm not necessarily going to do anything about it, like other than I've developed a lot of skills up to this point. I'm going to research a lot about ADHD and continue to do what I'm doing. But like, I personally don't necessarily feel like I need to take any sort of medication for it, because I have developed a lot of tools and skills for it. And I've organized my business in a way that like, either I do it or I hire or delegate or streamline it in a way that I don't have to do the executive function part. And to be honest, I like getting high. Like my body's natural high is super exciting and fun. And I have learned to play with it and use it to my advantage.
Yeah.
That's a long answer.
No, it's good. Because I think it's fascinating, because I think we have the stereotypical idea of ADHD as that kid who gets bad grades because they can't sit still during school. And it's so much wider and bigger than that. Like I was a straight A student. I was miserable because I was bored constantly, but like I didn't fit the stereotype of what people were looking for. Whatever opposite of a shout out is to parochial schools for having no social support for kids who are different in any way, shape, or form. So how it got missed, I have no idea when I look back on it. But like I was in grad school when I got my formal diagnosis. So like one graduate degree down, like I was a successful as society student, and yet just miserable throughout that schooling experience. So I was on the lookout for it as a parent, and definitely as we have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. As the 5-year-old started to develop and his brain grew a little bit, I was seeing like he's just tiny me. Like what did I need that I wasn't getting in my own development, and trying to provide that for him in a way. So he goes to a Waldorf school. It's very sensory friendly, and they go for walks every day. They're not doing homework. Like it's so good for him. And like that he likes school is amazing to me. So I'm like, we're going to ride this wave as long as we can.
That's amazing. No, like I had a similar experience. I was a straight A student, except for every now and then, like I have this memory of like in art class, I forgot to turn in a project. So I ended up getting an F on the project. So I had all A's except a C. And everybody's like, what happened here? And I was like, It's one of those like ADHD shames of like, I don't know, like I worked so hard on that project, but I just forgot to turn it in. So yeah, never was noticed. But like in grad school, for example, while learning and bringing in the info, I was like, oh, I know what to do with this. And I wrote my first book basically as I'm in grad school, like, oh, you know what, this would be so much better if we just prevented this stuff. Let's write this down. Like, I'm going to tell people what to do so they don't have to get here. So like, I'm still like taking all this in, but like, I basically brainstormed the outline for my premarital book in grad school. I wrote it later, but yeah, it's like, my brain was just goes so fast, which is again why it's like, no, I don't want to necessarily shift it. I just want to create an environment that works for it, you know? And I going back to kind of like parenting, that's a lot how I like to raise my daughter as well. You mentioned like making sure your kiddos in a different type of school. Right away, I got her an IEP so that we're fostering the school experience so that she is getting something positive out of it. And I'm happy to say like well, there's some areas of growth. There's some areas she does well. There's some areas that she's definitely going to have some struggle with. But like she says to me, I'm in love with writing. I'm like, that's so funny and great. I'm like, good. We're fostering that. And she loves art. And there's just, I don't know, there's different things that she's really good at. And so it's like, you know what, we're going to create an environment where you can flourish, and we will come up with what we call like ramps, like build ramps for the areas where you struggle.
Yeah. And like, I wasn't diagnosed till later. Sports like was my saving grace growing up. Like, yeah, you can't tire out an ADHD kid, but you can make it so they fall asleep at night because they're tired. Like, that was my experience, was like, I didn't have homework. I was always weeks ahead because I was bored. So it's just after school, sports. And like that idea of managing your dopamine through exercise and food. I just ate constantly, still do, because I don't have that shut off valve in my brain. That's some of my sensory issues around eating that I have. So yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to look at my misdiagnosis and then have a kid who has it and be like, what can I do differently?
Yeah.
So that he has a better experience with it.
You know, I definitely do that myself, but I don't know if you have some of this or not. So I talk about ADHD shame a lot, like that people who weren't diagnosed with ADHD sometimes pick up these little shames, areas where we're hard on ourselves because of some of our symptoms, right? And not having strategies, or sometimes the big consequences are what gave us our opportunity for strategies. But like something I've been challenging myself to do as a mom is I realized that one of my shames is when Olivia is struggling in an area like of school, because she, like I said, she's good in some areas, but she struggles in some areas too, right? So my daughter has complementary dyslexia, right? So it's not just ADHD, but it's dyslexia. And so I realized recently that I was being really hard on myself when it came to math homework, because she is struggling in math. And every time the school would send home homework, first I would beat myself up for some, for like, I guess giving her ADHD or like being one of the responsible parties for it, and so I'd be like, oh, and so I kept saying, I was like, I hate homework, but it's not that I hate the homework. It's that I hate the way I treat myself every time I pull her homework out of her book bag. And so that's one that I've recently had to like challenge myself out of like, no, Angela, it's homework. She'll do the best that she can, but you're not a bad mom because she struggles with math.
Yeah.
One recently I picked up on,
Yeah, a lot of my compensation, both my parents are teachers, so education was super important growing up, and I was raised in a high control religion as well. So it's not so much shame, but like it's that like overachieving is my standard. And if it's not overachieving, so I'm very cautious with like my boys of like, they are advanced in certain ways. Like their brains are very fast and move really quick, and they're good little athletes, which like was my growing up. So it's like being careful not to put that like you need to be exceptional at all times, because that's how I compensated. That's how I got through. Like I can't forget to turn something in because then I will be a failure. And so it was like none of it was healthy. It allowed me to have good grades and get through school, but like trying to not do that like ADHD exceptionalism. So I'm less on the shame side of it, but much more on the like unrealistic expectations of like, I can pick up this random thing and be really good at it with zero practice. Like, that's not reasonable. You can't expect that all the time. And so trying to like watch out for that with my kids so that I'm not putting that on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I mean, isn't exceptionalism just avoidance of shame, right? Like it's
Right.
avoidance. It's like I won't allow myself to feel bad or feel like a failure. So I'm going to be so good at this, so good at everything, or I'll avoid things that I'm not good at so I can still avoid feeling like a failure.
Yep. Yes. Yeah. You're talking about writing your books. And I'm like, oh man, my 3 that I have started, but none of them I finished.
Which, like, so how I've had to shift as I'm growing up. So like, it's interesting. I think that there's a lot of ways that it's weird, but shame and abuse can still kind of fuel certain tendencies, right? So like I realized that in writing my first 2 books, one of the things that fueled me was a fear of failure, right? Like I've got to keep doing this because I don't want to fail. And so that's one that I've actually recently unraveled, like I've let go of. And I think I've gotten much better at that one. Like I don't, it's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to make a mess. But it's funny, since the fear of failure drove my writing of the first 2 books. Now that I'm writing a 3rd book, so my 3rd book is Becoming Fuckable. It's going to be hilarious, all about sex. But like, I don't have that same fear of failure driving me. And so it's funny, I've had some stops and starts. Like I'll go and then I'll be like, and then I go and I was like, oh. So in some ways, the fear of failure was that dopamine hit that helped me with the executive function of writing the first 2 books. So I have, one of the ways I'm trying to adjust now that I've like let go of some of my shames is I just get help. Like it's okay to get a support. So I have somebody helping me with the book, so I'm writing, they're writing, but we're doing it kind of like joint to like help it move along better. Because without the fear of failure, I can be like, I'll get to it when I get to it. And a month passes, and I'm like, I got other shit to do.
That ADHD exceptionalism can kick in, where it's like, oh, I can crank out 12,000 words in a day, like if I need to. So like, I can compensate, but like again, that's not healthy.
Well, and it's funny. I know other people with ADHD that they ride. That's what they'll do, is they'll just ride their dopamine highs when they have them. So when they have them, they're like, all right, I'm going to use this and I'm going to use this to my advantage. I still think there's some value to doing that. I just think only using that's probably not going to get you far.
That's how I got through school. Was like, man, my master's thesis started the night before, like, which is awful. But like, that's at that point in higher education, that's how I had learned to do it. Like that was the only, because I wasn't looking at it from an ADHD lens. That's all I had learned that worked. It was like, well, I'll just put it off and not beat myself up about it and write it the day before. And I usually get good grades. We'll see what happens.
There you go. That's so interesting. Which in ADHD, people are very good at crisis, right? Like the crisis is that dopamine hit that we need to get there. And I am very good in crisis, right? Like it's my job to deal with people fighting. And but to your point earlier, it's interesting. Like it still has an impact on us as humans, right? And so if I have to be in that space for too long, then, and it's not a fun thing. So like with 3 couples fighting, that's my limit. Like I can't deal with emotions anymore. And my body is fried from having to manage those emotions. So I've also learned to kind of pick and choose my clients as I've been in practice now for over 10 years. So I do have the ability to kind of decide who my client caseload is. And so now I've developed a process of, people go through the assessment, and basically at treatment planning is when I decide whether they get to kind of stay or not, or we're a good fit, or if I need to refer them on. And to some degree, like how you were saying, I have to pick how many of the pregnancy clients, like high-risk pregnancy clients, I have to pick and choose how many volatile or hostile couples that I take because it's such taxing work.
Yeah. And it's hard to screen for that all the time because you don't always know until you have it in the room where people are at.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, well, I mean, for very hostile ones, usually they'll show up right up.
Sure. Yes.
But I don't know. Yeah. So that's one thing I look forward to is I kind of work with them over time, but not everybody gets to stick around. I really do need a caseload. Like I even put it on my website that I'm looking for best friends who just need that spark. That's my favorite client, is your best friends types who've just lost that sexual energy and excitement with each other, and they're trying to find it back. Because if they're best friends, they're probably treating each other nicely. They may be more conflict avoidant, which sex is a conflict. So like I'm teaching them how to lean into that conflict and tension with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. What have you seen focusing on sex as a niche that you're working with over the years? Like I look at something like Come As You Are, came out in like 2016, and it's on most, if not all, therapist bookshelves that I know. Like the idea, I think the availability of information for people has increased a lot. Like, do you feel that? Do you see that? Or do you still see some gaps there for people around their sexual knowledge that they're coming in with?
I mean, I definitely always see gaps because I'm in St. Louis, so people aren't getting that sex education. I'm grateful that it exists and it's out there. But if you've been going back to religiously traumatic spaces, one of the things that those religions do is they limit people's access to education, and they shame you for wanting to get that access. They know that college is where they lose their people. So their primary brainwashing, which they won't call it this, by the way, they call it, like we're raising our children and our values, but it is brainwashing, right? Like they limit their access to education. Like there's a reason why books are being banned from libraries. We're trying to limit access to other ways of thinking, because if you can usher somebody past a certain age into still believing in that kind of small box, then they will close off. And some people won't ever break free from it. They'll stay stuck in that mind, that style of thinking. And so there's very much, whether they're aware of it or not, and I feel like they are aware of it, there's an insidious sort of like keeping of education from their people. And where this came from in my life, this goes back to some of my own history. I love knowledge. I love to learn, like from childhood all the way till now. Like I just wanted to know things. And I was so curious, that's that ADHD curiosity, right? I want to know about this. I have 50 questions about everything, right? My daughter, she asks so many questions. I was thinking of her because she'll ask so many questions that sometimes we're like, hey, okay, we're done with questions for a bit because we just get tired. Like she wears us out. But I don't want her to stop questioning. I'm just saying in this moment, my question limit has been hit. It's a boundary. But like I was raised this just curious about everything. And in my world, like they would teach you that like this knowledge is of the world, or like this is once, and like even the words they use to know that like there's a phrasing around like you can't unknow these things. Once you've opened your mind to these things, like it's like people turn their backs on God to know this information. And it's funny if you think of Adam and Eve, like he ate an apple or whatever he ate, and then suddenly he knew things. He knew education. Like, so it's just interesting to me how much like knowledge is a threat in these communities, knowledge outside of your values and belief systems. And they are like, knowledge really is a type of empowerment, because when going back to what you were saying about like the sex education piece, like when these people do get access to sex education, they can't continue to believe in their like closed-minded ways of being. Like you can't grow as a sexual person and stay in that old world value system. And so to go back to the original question, I can track back. I've trained myself in therapy. Like it's there, but it is hard for people to access it or think to do it themselves because of how they're raised.
Yeah. And I work with, when I advertise for religious trauma, I get a lot of purity culture. And like people don't show up at my door. Often they don't realize it's religious trauma. Some people will show up knowing, because I think social media has done a good job of putting purity culture on blast. But like, I didn't have any sex education. It was parochial school, K through 12. So like, it was super shameful, super taboo. Like that wasn't a thing. I didn't leave the church right away. I just kept moving more and more progressive and more liberal. So even early in my career, I worked at a Christian counseling place, and it was hard to do some of that work that I knew I needed to do with the couples when they were adhering to a particularly strict understanding of scripture, because it's just unhealthy. It's propagating unhealthy boundaries, and it's propagating unrealistic expectations. So it was like, doing this work for me was kept pushing me further and further away from working with it outside of then, right, ethical concerns around LGBTQ people and yeah, lots of stuff. But yes, I'm in Wisconsin. So similarly, Midwest, more churches. Wisconsin has more bars, but more churches than anything else in the cities and in the towns. So there's that gap. I think the information's out there, but like you said, it's hard for people to know where to find it or that they need to find it.
Yeah. Well, and our job as therapists is still to work within people's value systems. So I'm very thoughtful in how I try to challenge those systems and work within them. Like it's kind of a mix, right? And so I get to know people's values, I try to understand them, and then I sprinkle in some growth, like plant seeds. It's like, here, so this is something different. Like one of the things I really have taken to heart since 2020 is when I see abuse, I am calling it out. I'm very tactfully calling it out, but when I see abuse, I want people to know, like, that's a form of emotional abuse. I don't know if you're aware of it. I don't think you're intentionally doing it, but here's how it is this. Because there are ways that people have been raised to see abuse as like normal or common, and it's not healthy, and it leads to a lot of harm. And whether it's religious abuse, whether it's even just neglect, like neglect was one I spent a lot of time thinking about too. Like there's ways that couples are emotionally neglecting each other. And I don't think they realize that as well. There's just this way that if your parents did this and this is all you've been modeled, you think this is normal. But like there's tons of couples that are just emotionally neglecting each other and affectionately, like touch-wise, neglecting one another.
Yeah. Often I use the phrase mindless or malice. Like the impact doesn't change a lot, even if the intention between mindlessness or maliciousness is very different.
Yeah. Which is why, it's so important when people apologize to not think so much about your intention. It's like apologize for impact. Like what impact did it have on others, not your intention behind it? Because, like this is such a terrible phrase, but like Hitler had good intentions, at least in his mind, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying what Hitler did is good. I'm saying
right. Just to clarify, we're not supporting.
Everybody's a good guy in their head. Everybody, like, I wanted to do this for this. I wanted to help in this way. This is what I thought was helpful. Like even being helpful, you can unintentionally impact people for harm. And so like being a thoughtful person, being kind, I know be kind is the new phrase that's out there in all the schools, which I love, but like kindness looks like examining your impact on this world, not your intention. Like we all have good intentions. It's rare for somebody to really be a villain, like, I'm going to destroy the world. Although I have been embracing my inner villain this last year and it's been quite fun. But that's just for greedy goodness.
Yeah. I wanted to be a mad scientist when I was a little boy. Like that was my goal. Have a volcano lair somewhere. That's what seemed really cool to me.
I still think that's a good life goal.
Yeah, maybe. I think my toddlers are going to join me on my quest. They seem pretty primed for that as well. Angela, what do you do outside of the office? What does self-care, what does joy look like in your life? How do you kind of cultivate taking care of yourself when you're not in the room with clients?
Oh, so many ways. There's behavioral and emotional ways that I do this. One is through responsibility, challenging myself to let go of responsibility outside of these walls, letting my guard down. So when I'm done, this is what I mean by these walls is these therapy walls, right? So when I'm done, I really close the door and I move into a space of this is my downtime. I don't have to save anyone. I don't have to solve any problems. Like I'm here to just be myself. I do it through the people that I have in my life. So I always make sure I pick two-way relationships with friends and family members. And if a family member doesn't fit into that, then I might create distance in that relationship. So, and there are some family members. I happen to have some preachers in the family. So some family members that I've cultivated some distance with. So it looks like boundaries and friendships and family, making sure that it's a good two-way relationship and that I'm minimizing drama in my life day to day. That doesn't mean people can't have feelings. It just means if I want to be able to share, they can share, but also we can have fun. I am having fun all the time, actually, afterwards. Like sometimes we have Lego nights with my kiddo. Sometimes it's funny. I wrote this list of all the things that we do, and I was like, oh, wow, I do a lot. That's another one of these mom traumas I'm working on, is like moms always feel like we're never enough. And recently I wrote this list of like, these are all the cool things I do with my kid. And I was like, holy cow, this is the longest list ever. I was like, you have no right to have mom trauma around. You do enough, Angela. You do enough. But like we do Lego nights. We do, what do you call it? Shoot, Nerf gun nights. We have roller skating. We have dance parties. We have certain shows she and I like to watch. That's if it's family fun time. Then there's couples fun time. So me and my partner, Shane is his name, we have time that's just the two of us. We have a hot tub we go out to in the evenings to just relax once my daughter's gone to bed. So from 9 to 10 is our hour. We don't do it every night, but I'd say every week we go at least once or twice. He and I have things like we do country line dancing and date nights. And we do get weekends away from my kiddo. Not like constantly. I'm not leaving her all the time either, but there's,
Right.
I call it sharing priorities. You can't make anything first all the time. So it's like sharing priority, right? And so a little bit of when I think of self-care, I think of this field of piles, kind of like if you were playing Settlers of Catan or Stone Age. Those are my favorite economics games. So like you build your piles up, right? So anytime you're playing these games, basically you're collecting different resources to build things, right? But at any point in the game, you have to look at your piles and be like, oh, what do I need more of, right? And so when I think of self-care, I think of this field of piles, and you look at the different needs in life, and it's like, okay, nothing's ever going to be perfectly in balance, but you got to look at, okay, what pile's low? Oh, okay, I haven't got as much couple quality time. So how do I put some energy and like build this pile up a little more? Or, oh, you know what? I haven't had alone time. I haven't invested in a hobby lately or some girl time, So like, basically that's what I do is regular scans across my field of piles of needs and work on just making sure that there's regular placement into those piles. And then really I've just created a quality of life that doesn't require coping all the time. This is so crazy, but like this is a long answer, and I think it's an important one. A bigger part of self-care. So I exercise, I do all the fun things, but it's not the activities themselves. It's having a whole quality of life. In my job, I no longer put myself constantly in go mode where I have to go. Like even in my work, it's like I'm low key, I'm taking care of myself, and I'm managing what clients I take on. After work, it's shut off. I have a clear boundary around, nope, I'm not doing work anymore. You all can fuck off. Like, and I even tell my clients when I go on vacation, I'm not going to answer. Like, I literally say, you'll fuck off. And they love it. They laugh because I'm a cusser. Yeah. They appreciate that honesty, but I really won't. I won't talk to them. It's like they don't exist. So when I take a vacation, I'm fully gone. And basically, it's a whole life, quality of life experience. I have a lot of affection with my partner, and we have a great sex life. And so like that's cultivating that has been a part of my self-care, because then you get all the dopamine and oxytocin and endorphins, right? But so basically it's just living a whole quality of life where I don't have to constantly be in that like fight or flight system. So it's interesting why this is coming up is that I was recently at this wedding and the mother of the bride screamed at me because I was offering snacks at lunchtime to everybody. Like my sister had asked me to bring some snacks so that people could eat if they're not like, when people are getting ready for a wedding, they don't always think about like, oh, I'm kind of hungry, I should eat, right? So I literally was like, I'm just going to take the table. I'm not trying to ruin all your cool decorations. I'll put it to the side, but I'm just putting snacks out, right? And this lady goes, no, like the mother of the bride screams at me. And it's interesting. So I went into my coping of like, that's not cool. Not okay with that. Like you need to cool it, So I put her in her boundary, but then I went into that fawn of like being super nice. And so I hate that fawn mode a little bit because it reminds me of my religious trauma. But anyhow, circling this all story back, I realized that like I had some processing to do after that weekend, and I'm okay. Like I made it through. It's not a common thing. I will never really see that mother of the bride again, like she's not in my life. But like, I realized that I've created a life where I don't have to cope like that often. It's a rare occasion. So where we do need our coping techniques for situations like that, because I can't live in a world where there isn't shit sometimes, right? And that was a little shitstorm I had to deal with. So I have it when I need it, but I'm also super grateful that I have cultivated a life where the people in my life I don't have to cope with. I can just be myself. And I don't have people like that just constantly. Rah, 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 rah. And in general, it's more rare now that I ever have to do that coping technique. And so that is, to me, the bigger answer of self-care, is creating a whole quality of life with every choice being intentional about bringing in goodness and giving goodness out into the world. So that's the answer.
Yeah. Well, and I love that, because I try and sneak in like, where's your joy when I ask this question? Because I think the conversation around self-care sort of implies that we should be under some level of stress all the time. And I don't like that. I don't inherently disagree with it. Like, hey, the world's on fire. We're all dealing with some environmental trauma. But like, like, yes, we need to regulate our systems and we need to be aware of those things. But also, like you're saying, having boundaries in place and creating space where joy can exist, where your quality of life can be high, like, that's different than just, I checked this box of self-care at the end of my day.
That's survival versus thriving, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm joyful all the time, but because I've created a whole quality of life where that's a possibility.
Yeah. And I use cultivate, which is a word. I use a lot of gardening metaphors, even though I'm terrible at gardening. Because I think, like, a lot of these things, it's like, right, we're not crossing some finish line. There's work, there's effort to go into it. But when you've created a healthy environment, it's minor maintenance, some random occurrence at a wedding maybe ticks off a response, but like, it's minor. There's some weeding that goes on, but things are growing. The nurturing has happened. So now that growth can happen.
I like that way. It's like there's some weeding, like you have to weed out some things, right? Like that was a weeding, but whatever. Okay, a weed popped up. For the most part, I have this really beautiful garden, and actually, like, I've started like getting rid of perfectionism, for example. Like, I don't say, it doesn't even have to be it can be a good enough day. Like, was it a good enough day? It's a good enough day. It's a pretty good day. Like, even giving myself like wins there. It's like, yeah, it's good enough. I got some things done. I laughed a bit. It's a good enough day.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah, I struggle with that still, with that exceptionalism. I was raised in the, like, you got 5 A+, but what was that class that you got an A in? Like, I don't know. So I still have to work through some of that stuff. Angela,
we're working, right?
yeah, you hinted at a new book coming up.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm writing the book Becoming Fuckable, and it is about desire, and it's actually a reframe on some of the desire stuff that's out there. Like, I know Emily Nagoski talks about responsive versus spontaneous desire, which I think are good starts. I'm going to take them and add to create more of a spectrum, because I do think those particular terms have some deep roots still in heteronormative sexuality. And so I have kind of developed my own system for how to teach people how to refine their desire and their interest in sexuality. And which I think Emily was already doing this. I couldn't do any of this without her work. I greatly appreciate everything she's done, but like, we're supposed to add, like, take it and run with it, right? So I've taken some of her work and run with it in a new direction, but adding some different ways of looking at things. Each section covers a different thing. So there's an individual section of like things you need to do, like ways to unravel shame in yourself, ways to become more open to being a sexual person and allow yourself to take on that identity, and then behaviors that you can do that help you really own that sexual identity. As in the individual section, then there's like the couple section, and all of them have like fuck language. So fuck me is the individual section. Fucking people is the couple section, where you like having sex with other people. Then there's down to fuck, which is like all about sex and how to have sex and what are the fun things, like different cool things that you can do, different journeys, sexual journeys you can take. The whole framing is like sex is a journey. And then of course the end has to be cluster fucks, when sex becomes problematic.
Sure. Love it. These are fantastic.
Yeah, the whole book is fun fuck language. I use fuck because I love it. It's like I'm wanting to like use it in sort of positive ways and exploratory ways, but like to really give people kind of like, even people who have great sex lives still deal with problems, right? And like that's actually a normal part of a sex life. So like the the clusterfucks are all about like different ways that couples can approach sexual problems in a proactive and positive ways. And it's just really like basically teaching creative sexuality, how to step outside the heteronormative bubble and learn how to be creative and playful and really own sexuality for what it is, you know, like this wonderful, I don't know. I feel like it's the essence of joy. It really is. And so that book is coming out in the next year. And of course, you'll see little tidbits on my YouTube channel as well, because I've got the YouTube channel on sex and relationships and parenting as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I follow you on YouTube. I love your YouTube channel. I love how there's a lot of great sex educators out there, and like coming out of being raised in purity culture, like for me, it's still very like an embodied experience for people who are talking freely about sex and engaging in those conversations. So I love that. It's always been like clinical. I don't want to say clinical. It's been like a thing I did as a therapist, but it's so nice to hear other people talking about it freely. So like, yeah, you just have, I don't know, one of your popular videos is how to give a penis massage. Like, and it's just like, hey, yeah. Awesome. Like people should, like, it's okay to have questions around this stuff. So let's talk about what we know and what research says and like how to talk about it.
That is the most popular video, actually, Jeremy. And which is sad because how to give a vulva massage is like, I guess, second, but I would like it to be first.
Yeah, that's probably what fewer people know about, right? If we're being honest. Yeah.
It's okay though. It's getting out there. That's the big point, is that we're putting the information out so people can talk comfortably and casually about sex, which is my ultimate goal. I want sex out of that flight response and into that parasympathetic nervous system where it's like, no, this is relaxed. This is okay. This is a normal part of your life. Like that's what I'm trying to do with couples and individuals in writing the book, is like really sex needs to become comfortable and casual for you to have good sex.
Right. Yes. I often refer to it as the OG stress relievers, having an orgasm. So like that idea of being able to say like, hey, this is a good, useful thing in your life. Yeah. Awesome. And we'll post to the YouTube channel. I recommend it. I don't know if it's because we're neurodivergent and so my brain likes your brain, but that the way you approach things and talk about things, I mean, they're short videos. You do like 2 to 5 minute videos. A lot of your clips are. So it's complex stuff kind of filtered through a lens that's pretty understandable. So we'll have that in the show notes to recommend it. And where else can people find your work?
Oh, a therapistInSt.Louis.com. That's my company website. And I have everything kind of at a hub there. So if you want to find me, really go there. You can find the videos, the podcasts, anything I do, therapistInSt.Louis.com.
Yeah, awesome. And we'll have that in the show notes as well. Angela, thanks so much for coming on. This has been great.
Thank you for having me, Jeremy. This is fun.
Yeah, and I am for sure. And, yay! And to all the listeners out there, thanks for tuning in again. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.